all good things must come to an end. Well, and even not so good things. I don't know where you are on this whole Napoleon thing, but the point is that eventually it fell apart. Kind of like my beautiful balancing puzzle here, which I did. I love it a lot, but eventually it's going to come apart. In this video, we're going to look at how it all fell apart for Napoleon. What happened and how? And what did this mean for the revolution? Okay, let's get going. For this video, you're going to need two primary sources. The first one is the Berlin Decrees, and the second is the Sonatus Consultum deposing Napoleon in 1814. The story of the fall of the empire is really first and foremost a military story. So let's start there and look at the wars of the coalitions and try to figure out what Napoleon was trying to do while he was in power. It doesn't really need to be said that Napoleon was an extraordinarily impressive military commander. From his time as commander of the Army of Italy through his victory at Wagram, Napoleon was seemingly invincible. His success had to do with a lot of factors, one of which was his tactical innovativeness. Napoleon's armies were quick. They fought successive battles in a matter of days. They packed light and lived off the land so that they could mobilize quickly and move efficiently. Napoleon was also very successful in establishing a sort of esprit de corps, a commitment on the part of soldiers to obey orders and identify with a larger cause. He often promoted soldiers for battlefield valor and even awarded some with money and noble titles. The result of all of this was that by 1806, his armies either occupied or had forced obedience from nearly all of continental Europe. There was really only one enemy that lay out of Napoleon's reach: the United Kingdom. Since the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, a battle in which Admiral Horatio Nelson's navy decimated the French fleet, the prospect of an invasion of England was out of the question. Months later, Napoleon decided that the only way to subdue England then was to do so from the outside. Napoleon decided that a sort of reverse blockade by which continental Europe refused to purchase English goods could weaken the British economy and ideally bring them to negotiate. He saw it as an opportunity for French industry to replace British goods in European markets, thus bolstering the French economy. The centerpiece of the strategy was what was called the Berlin Decree of November 1806, in which Napoleon ordered that all ports be closed to British ships. The policy was named the Continental System. The entire continent was to be united in its resistance to Britain. Yet the system only worked if all countries on the continent were compliant. All of Europe had to refuse to purchase British goods, or else the sanctions wouldn't have their intended effect. And that was ultimately the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Despite his best efforts, Napoleon could not maintain total compliance with the Berlin Decree and the other measures that he put in place to cripple the British trade. The first domino to fall was Portugal. Portuguese merchants had had a long-standing relationship with the British. Napoleon's measures devastated the merchant community in Portugal and eventually pushed them to engage in black market smuggling of British goods. British products began making their way into Europe via the Iberian Peninsula. Sugar from the British colonies, for example, came into Portugal, made its way all the way to Vienna, and in some cases even circled back and ended up getting sold to people in France itself for some 10 times the cost now. Meanwhile, Spanish rebels were resisting the rule of Napoleon's brother, whom he set on the Spanish throne. The whole peninsula became a problem area for Napoleon, and he ended up committing upwards of 50,000 troops there to force compliance with the continental system and the control of his deputies. Napoleon called the whole situation his Spanish ulcer, resistance that started to break Napoleon's control of Europe. A second domino was on the other end of the continent. Russian merchants also suffered from the continental system. They'd had a lucrative trade relationship with the British based around their supply of timber for the British Navy and building projects. The Tsar eventually felt pressure from his own Russian nobles to restore the trade relationship with Britain and defy the French emperor. Eventually, the Tsar began to open up trade networks with the British once again and even began taxing French goods, a move that was too much for Napoleon to handle. Russia pushed Napoleon over the edge and led him to marshal his armies once more to force his European allies into compliance again. Before we look at the results of this new phase of war with the coalitions, we should pause and sort of think a little bit more about the continental system, what Napoleon was trying to do in it. So to do that, I want you to now pause the video and take a look at our first primary source, the Berlin Decrees. Right, so the end of the document tells you about the specific measures that Napoleon was mandating across the European continent. But the first part of the document is perhaps more interesting. Look at some of the reasons that Napoleon gives for the embargo. Check these out, for example. He says, here are the reasons that they're going to enact all of these decrees, right? And they're blaming the British for all these things. They say that this monstrous abuse of the right of blockade has no other aim than to prevent communication among nations and to build the commerce and industry of England on the ruins of the commerce and industry of the continent. That since this is the obvious aim of England, whoever deals on the continent in English merchandise thereby favors her designs and renders himself her accomplice, and that it is a natural right to oppose the enemy with such arms as it makes use of, and to fight it in the same way as it fights when it has disregarded all ideas of justice and all liberal sentiments, a consequence of civilization among men. What's most interesting in these passages is the way that even in this type of document, we see influences of the rhetoric and discourse of the Revolution. Napoleon justifies his actions as an exercise of his own natural right to oppose those who are doing him harm. He accuses the British of disregarding all ideas of justice and all liberal sentiments, particularly in taking the war to the home front. In other words, Napoleon's casting himself here as the defender of natural rights and the protector of life and liberty against an oppressive external enemy. This is all from the revolutionary playbook. It's so similar to the declarations of war that we saw from revolutionaries earlier on in the semester. Next step, force compliance. Napoleon's armies were already trying to do this in the Iberian Peninsula, but what happened with Russia is really the next part of our story. The invasion of Russia really began in the summer of 1812. Napoleon mounted his largest army yet to invade the Tsar's domains, something in the ballpark of over 500,000 soldiers. The army itself was composed of conscripts from France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Poland, and Lithuania. In other words, it was a cosmopolitan group, and one that, in contrast to some of Napoleon's early armies, was forced through conscription to participate and fight for a foreign ruler. Now, you've read about the story of the invasion and how it went. Napoleon searched for a decisive battle. The Tsar instead retreated and looked for the climate and time to do the work of attrition that he felt necessary to win. 300 miles into Russia, Napoleon's army had already been reduced by a third. 400 miles into Russia, only 160,000 troops were still available. Eventually, Napoleon made it to Moscow, but the city was already abandoned and on fire by the time he got there. The Tsar refused to sue for peace, and so Napoleon, devoid of a decisive victory and suffering from supply chain problems, decided to issue the retreat. On their way back west, the retreating French army was harassed by Cossack cavalry, who saw the opportunity not only to chase their enemies out of Russia, but to tear them apart so they could never mount an invasion again. It so happened that this was also when winter hit with full force. Only about 60,000 troops returned across the river Bersina, near Minsk. Over 400,000 had died. The campaign destroyed Napoleon's base of power and enforcement. Napoleon made it back to Paris on December 18th, 1812. The defeat was devastating. Not only was Napoleon's army completely decimated, the commitment that many of his forced allies had to supporting him waned rapidly. Upon his retreat, Napoleon began pulling French troops from regions that they occupied prior to the invasion. So French troops garrisoned in Germany and the Netherlands and Poland all began to return home. This created a power vacuum. Locals used the reduced French presence as an opportunity to organize resistance once again to the emperor. In Brandenburg, for example, Landwehr, or patriotic militias, rose up and began resisting French troops and administrators. They called for a Befreiungskrieg, or a war of liberation. Some 120,000 volunteers joined the efforts to expel the French entirely from their domains. Meanwhile, Russia began to resurrect the coalition that had fought against France in the past. In the treaties of Teplitz and Kalisz and Chaumont, the Russians, British, Austrians, and Prussians once again joined forces to attack the emperor. The British provided £5 million to its allies to help supply their troops. Members of the new coalition vowed not to broker separate peace settlements with France. Pressure began to mount on the retreating emperor. Desperate, Napoleon tried once again to revive his army and defend France. As his territorial control dwindled, however, the burden fell almost entirely on the French population once again. New conscription decrees came out that forced young French men once again into the army. The conscription decrees, understandably, were met with resistance, particularly from those areas that had resisted such decrees in the past, namely the Vendée and Brittany. Napoleon's control and popular appeal were falling apart. The bedraggled French army and the armies of the coalition finally met in October 1813 outside of Leipzig. In a showdown titled the Battle of the Nations, Napoleon's forces were outnumbered 2-1. The battle raged for 3 straight days, and by the end of it, Napoleon's forces were overwhelmed. Scarcely a third of his army survived, and Napoleon's command of Europe seemingly ended. The coalition chased Napoleon all the way back to Paris. By the end of March, they had captured the city, the first time in any of the revolutionary wars that the capital of France had fallen. Revolts erupted in nearly every satellite kingdom, the Kingdom of Holland, the Kingdom of Westphalia, etc. Napoleon's administrators all fled. Seeing the writing on the wall, the members of the French Senate even decided that it was now time to turn their back on the emperor. In a Sonatus Consultum on April 3, 1814, the Senate formally deposed Napoleon and declared themselves for a restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. Even Napoleon's generals began to turn on him. Grand Marshal Augereau, the one-time son of a domestic servant turned general and member of the Legion of Honor, declared to his army on April 16th, "Soldiers, the Senate, the interpreter of the will of a nation weary of the tyrannical yoke of Napoleon Bonaparte, pronounced his abdication and that of his family. The legislative body, the grand dignitaries, the marshals, generals, and all the corps of the Grand Army have given their support to the decrees of the Senate. Soldiers, you are freed from your oaths, both by the nation in whom sovereignty resides and by the abdication of a man who, having sacrificed thousands of victims to his cruel ambitions, refused to die like a soldier." Tough words from once a very close ally. Napoleon officially lost the support that he had counted on for his entire reign. Without his collaborators, he was left to the devices of his foreign enemies. Now it's time for one more primary source. Check out the Sonatus Consultum that deposed the emperor in 1814. It's a pretty radical statement considering it came from a body that was utterly dedicated to the emperor for basically every year before this. Harsh words from the senators here. Besides the nationalistic arguments that they brought up, accusing Napoleon of not being French, for example, the Senate also rewrote the history of Napoleon and his attachment to the revolution. The emperor was no longer the defender of the revolution. Rather, he was just simply another king, determined to attain power for his own purposes and personal glory. Check this passage out. Right? At the end of our civil discord, they wrote, referring to the revolution, "You chose for a leader a man who appeared on the world's scene with a character of grandeur. You placed all your hopes in him. Those hopes were deceived. On the ruins of anarchy, he built despotism." Upon his fall, Napoleon was simply a despot to those who had supported him. He did not restore order to a chaotic France now. Rather, he took advantage of anarchy to install despotism. This shows how even Napoleon's supporters eventually turned on him in the wake of his losses on the battlefield. Such was the end of the long reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, at least for now. One of the big points here is that Napoleon's power was directly tied to his success on the battlefield. When he started losing, not only did his European allies start revolting, but his popular support within France began to wane. And when his popular support went away, it took with him some of his claims to the revolution's legacy. When the Senate and even his generals, in no uncertain terms, declared him as decidedly not the heir of the revolution, it impacted the way that he was able to kind of tie himself to the goals and the values and the agenda of the revolution. But this was not his final act. In the next video, we're going to take a look at Napoleon's last desperate grasp at power and at claiming the sort of legacy of the revolution for himself. But until then, good job, good luck, see you soon.